Hi folks, welcome back to another episode of Talking Conservation. In the previous episode, we had with us Sean Wheatley, and Sean is back with us again because what we're talking about now is Sean's expertise here with regard to decorative plasterwork. So the really kind of ornate ceilings, specifically what we're talking about here. So tune in, here we go. Hello and welcome to Talking Conservation,
the podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
with me, Rich Aylesbury.
And me, Stephen Boniface.
Okay, Sean, so we spoke in our previous episode about your background and the fact that you're now a master plasterer. Is that the right pronunciation?
Worshipful company of plasterers, but we're classed as master plasterers.
That's great. But your particular expertise and what I've seen you do with ease, and yet everyone else struggles, is to do decorative plasterwork. So when we talk about decorative plasterwork, what is the ornamentation beyond the flat ceiling, as it were? So just talk us through what that actually means to you when we say ornamentation and decorative plasterwork. What are the extremes that we might find in that?
Ornamentation and decorative plasterwork, probably late 1400s, early 1500s is when it was first seen. Before that, ceilings were flat, as were the walls. Henry VIII was very instrumental. The Italian stuccatori that he brought over started to carry out this wonderful ornamental plasterwork. It can run from a simple coving or cornice running between the top of the wall line and the ceiling. It might then have early plasterwork would have single ribs running across the ceiling in a geometric pattern, whether it's squares, hearts, kites, all joining together in a geometric style. Simple mouldings in relief of no more than 1.5 inches in the early ones, 1.5 inches or 35 mil, I think that might be, by 40, 50 mil wide. Simple shapes, and they caught the light. So cornices, ribs running across the ceiling, ornamentation with the simple lighting that they had, it caught the light and made it look a lot grander than it did. Early plasterwork was all run in situ, run by hand. So the cornices, we would cut a running mould, cut a profile, mount it up on a slipper with a brace, the running mould, running a cornice. The early ones would have just been in timber. They wouldn't have used zinc at the time. They would have had a piece of timber. They would have sharpened to the edge that they were looking for and throw the plaster up there and run it through. Simple thumb moulds would have been used, timber. You might hold a piece of stick on the ceiling and draw this thumb mould backwards and forwards, creating the shape. So that's where early English plasterwork started. Fibrous plasterwork, which came in about the 1850s, 1855, I think, first seen in this country at the Great Exhibition in 1851. Fibrous plasterwork is where they had the ability, the materials available to them to make a master on a bench of a profile of cornice that you wanted, and then take a squeeze from that, and using cast-in plaster and hessian with thin wooden laths built into the back of this, or thrown into the back of it, quite literally, struck off on the edges, and then you'd turn the mould over and release it. So you could make huge lengths of cornice in a workshop, bring it to site and fix it up. Whereas anything before the 1850s was all run by hand. So the bigger the cornice, the wider the cornice, the more building out you would have to do, the more time on site. You can understand why people embraced fibrous plasterwork, because it could be made in a workshop, brought to site, fixed up, and away you go. That could all be done prior as it was needed. It would come and be fixed, and away you go.
Sorry, so the term fibrous, is that referring to having fibres within it, or the hessian, or does that just mean it's built off site and then fixed on site?
My understanding would be that it's because of the hessian and that was used. So you would, if you have a reverse mould, you would flick casting plaster, just casting plaster and water mixed together into a mix. You would flick that into the back of a mould. You'd let that pick up slightly and firm up, but not go hard. You would then lay hessian into the back of it.
That's the fibres, I'm guessing, that we're talking about.
The hessian lengths. You would then roll soaked thin wooden laths, normally of softwood, into the top of the cornice and the bottom of the cornice, roll the hessian around them, and then put more casting plaster on the back. So what might give a profile that projects into the ceiling by 200 mil or more, and down the wall by the same, literally cuts the corner in a sort of Georgian style. The actual plaster on that would be no more than 20 to 25 mil thick at the deepest in places. And some places it'll be barely 10 mil thick. So you can make huge cast copies in lightweight fibrous material that you can then bring to site, fix it up, and then joint it up. We tend to call it the new kids on the block. I mean, 1855 still hasn't stood the test of time. It's now classed as historic plasterwork because it's over 100 years old. There are some formidable fibrous plaster workshops out there doing great work, fantastic work. And the reality is a lot of the ceilings that you'll look at, generally you wouldn't know if it's fibrous, cornice, or whether it's run in situ. Trained eye would. That's the idea of it, really. It should blend into one.
But the actual plaster, you mentioned casting plaster for the fibrous work. Is that the same plaster that you'd use if you're doing a running mould as well? Or are there different mixes depending on exactly what you're doing?
There are different mixes. If you're matching early English plasterwork, certainly from what we've seen, the fine finishing coat, the backing coats would be the same backing coats that we would use on the laths as a pricking up coat, on the masonry walls as a scratch coat or first coat or float coat, 2.5 parts sand, 1 part mature line putty with lots and lots of hair and fibres in it. That would be the muffle coats or the backing coats. The fine finishing coats of early English plasterwork was generally a very mature putty, fine aggregate with fine white hair in it, goat hair. And then when gypsum plaster of Paris, fibrous plaster, casting plaster, when that became available. Today's traditional mixes, we would use, as a fine finishing coat, we mix 2 volumes of putty, 1 volume of water, and then we flood that water with casting plaster until all the water has been taken up, mix the two together, and that goes on at about 4 mil deep, and then run the running mould backwards and forwards to give you a clean finish.
So when did the casting plaster of Paris, whatever we call it, when did that come in? That wasn't the 1850s. It was before that, wasn't it?
I'm not 100% sure on the dates. It was before that. It was long before the 1850s. I seem to remember someone saying that it's early 1500s, I believe. I would double check on that. It would have been a different product that we know today as plaster of Paris. It would have been much grittier, much grainier than the very fine, chemically almost, well, it is a laboratory, isn't it? The factories turn out these products clinical, whereas the earlier gypsum that would have been used would have been much coarser, which also shows in some of the early enrichments that have been cast. It's almost like an aggregate in them as opposed to the pure fine casting plasters that we would use today.
Just thinking back to the different types of plasterwork, though, I mean, I've seen some fantastic, very ornate plasterwork from the Jacobean period where you see these very deep features, hanging down and moulded and things that I understand have got various armatures within them. But then within 100, 150 years, you've got the Robert Adam, very, very fine, delicate plasterwork. So what are they basically the same thing, but just used very, very differently? Or is the same principle, or are there significant differences? Talk us through that change in plaster.
Early English plasterwork, a lot of it was hand modelled in situ. They did have early stamps for repetitive work, could have been wooden moulds, reverse carved wooden moulds. So a very talented person would carve a lion's head into a block of timber, normally a fruit wood, softer to carve, dust it with French chalk, and then pack into it a very mature putty with a fine aggregate, and quite often with fine hair, pack that in, and then either try and turn it over, or even from that point, dampen the ceiling that you're working on and try and press it onto the ceiling and take the mould off from there. That's why the ceiling we did 1632, 13 cherubs, ugly little critters, on the ceiling. And whilst they appeared to come from the same mould, each one had slight imperfections in it. And we're convinced that that's where it was a reverse mould that was pressed onto the ceiling. They tap it 2 or 3 times, they do, strike it, and there's bound to be bits of plaster left in the mould. So those bits would just be made by hand. why one of the cherubs had a nose over to one angle while the wings were slightly offset. So that period of imperfections, really, it was never designed. Whereas when you get to Robert Adam, the moulds that they had, the ability, which might have been gelatine moulds or rubber moulds, you could replicate many moulds, many enrichments from the same mould, and they would all be identical.
So by that time, they were using gelatine or rubber by the Adam period, you're saying?
I believe so. Wax moulds or clay moulds could have been used. If you've hand modelled something and you press clay over the top and pull it off, you could get 2 or 3 casts or more from that clay mould, and then effectively rework it, press it over and go again. The silicones that we use today take your thumbprint. They are so accurate. Robert Adams' style, I've got to be honest, isn't my favourite style. Very, very repetitive. One of the ceilings that we worked on at Brocket Hall, in 4 square metres of ceilings, we replaced 428 leaves, 5 different sizes within those, beautifully detailed. But it's not my favourite period of plasterwork, is the honest truth. Huge repetition. Luckily, because it was repeated in quarters, the area we're working on, we could take silicone squeezes from the other side of the room for the enrichments that were missing, rather than having to cut them down or do anything. We can take silicone squeezes in situ to replicate them. And they were all from moulds. There was no hand modelling on that at all. There was no individuality to any of the enrichments. They were all cast beautiful.
A lot of the work that you do is repair of these decorative ceilings that have failed or had an issue or damage or otherwise. I'd like to ask you a philosophical question, which is more on the SPAB philosophy with regard to, I guess, the honest repair with these sort of things where something has been damaged. How does that work when you're effectively trying to recreate something that has been lost and you're trying to match a pattern? How does that sort of philosophy work into that? I'm curious.
We would always do our best to repair the ceiling. If it's a complete ceiling that's failed or fire, we'll take the fragments from that, piece them together, try and take silicone squeezes from that. If it's gone too far and it has to go back, we'll have them hand modelled. My hand modelling is slow. I enjoy it, but it's I couldn't make money at it. So I would employ some of the people that we come across through the SPAB, younger students that have left art school, so talented modelling clay. So they can model something for us. We can then take silicone squeezes, cast them, and obviously take all the glory. So if it's an enrichment that's broken and missing, then as long as there's a photo there, we can scale it down. But generally speaking, conservation and restoration, we do our best to repair it, whilst, the beauty of a repair, if the ceiling is undulating, it should be repaired like for like. So if it was a hand model ceiling, or the cornices or the ribs were run on a thumb mould quite crudely, which is part of their beauty, we would now do the same. We'll make up a thumb mould, carve it out in timber. We would hold a piece of timber to draw it from. If we wanted a circle, we would just attach a string to it rather than a gig stick or a piece of timber. So it's going to have undulations. It needs to match. On a ceiling, the project we got coming up, which is 1640, I think. The ribs that have been run have clearly been run by hand, and we've got about 3 square meters to replace. So we're going to run them by hand. When it comes to the enrichments, the fleur-de-lis or whatever they are, the ones that we've got to replace, we're going to clean up. We've got an original. We're going to clean all the paint off of it and get it back to as good as it was. Cast from that and then stick it up, as opposed to taking a squeeze from something that's covered in paint and has lost a lot of its detail. We would rather, if there were anything to happen to the ceiling in the future, or the walls, or wherever the enrichments have come from, at this point, if they find our one, they'll be able to clean it back and they've got something to work from. Whereas if we cast from something that's covered in paint, as much as they clean our one up, it will always be slightly disfigured with a loss of detail. What we tend to do is clean them up, take a squeeze, cast them, and then give them 4 or 5 coats of paint to try and blend them into the originals.
Gosh.
You mentioned cleaning up the plaster work. There will be a lot of people, like as I've done myself with my first house, painstakingly with toothbrushes and dental picks and things like that, getting the paint and the layers off and trying to work out how best to do it without damaging it. Is that something you have to do yourself? And if so, have you got any tips for how people can get some of those layers off without causing too much damage?
We've very successfully taught keen homeowners to do it themselves. Sometimes life is too short. We enjoy it. Don't get me wrong. It's very rewarding to take a ceiling centre or a length of cornice that's completely coated and caked in paint, and to clean it back and to see the veins on the vines and the rest of it, and the leaves with their detail is beautiful. It's time consuming, is the honest truth. So what we tend to do for those clients that are keen, I can go there for half a day. I can try warm water or 3 other chemical peels, come back the following day, clean those off, see which one has been most effective. If it's a chemical peel, if the warm water or steam hasn't worked, and then instruct them and show them how to go about it. And with, I think they're about £5 or £6 for 5 or 6 little balsa wood clay modelling tools of various shapes and sizes. They're very effective. It's disappointing when people get keen with steam. The more water you add to soften the paint also softens the plaster. And if you're using sharp dental tools, which are brilliant in the right hands, you can scratch the living daylights out of the originals. But no, we've done that probably 3 or 4 occasions. We've done that. Taught homeowners. They come home from work, sit on the scaffold, or on a tower scaffold with a bottle of wine, chatting away to each other and peeling off the paint. But it's so rewarding. It really, really is. But it is a labour of love for a lot of people to employ conservation plasterers to come in and do that for you. It's time consuming. Whilst we're going to be a bit quicker than your average homeowner, it's still a time-consuming project, but very rewarding for those that want to do it. So that's how we take that approach. If someone wants to do it, we'll, like I say, we go around, trial it for them, find out which of the chemical peels works best, and leave it to them.
And as you said earlier, when you're taking a squeeze, it's much better to do it off a piece of perfectly clean plaster rather than one that's still got the paint on it. So in those instances, you'd probably, if someone's got a section of cornice missing or something like that, you'd encourage them to clean in the way you've just described a section, so that you can then come and take the squeeze off the cleaned up plaster to then do that repair. Is that how it would normally work?
That's how I'd like to do it. The piece, if you're repairing part of a wall or part of a line of cornice, it's going to look very different. But if you give it 3 or 4 coats of paint straight away, it's going to blend in, rather than taking a squeeze from something that's caked in paint with no detail. There's not a lot of joy in that, really. I think it's best to clean it back, and then if you want it to blend in, just give it another 2 or 3 coats of paint. Soft distempers traditionally were used on ceilings as opposed to lime wash. And the soft distempers, their chalk content, if the cornice, which would have looked crisp and sharp and beautiful, hopefully how we leave some of our repairs, if the decorator isn't familiar with dampening it down enough before they start applying the soft distempers, the soft distemper or the plaster, the casting plaster and the putty crave moisture. So as soon as you apply, it just draws in, and it needs to be brushed in and worked in rather than just an amount on a brush and then trying to scrub it out best you can. So yeah, I'll try and clean them up first before you take a squeeze. And homeowners can do that. There's lots of products available. Silicone putty is a 2-part putty, 1 part blue, 1 part white. And putty as in the texture, same amount of each. You rub them together in your hands until it becomes one uniform colour to make sure it's all mixed. You press that onto the enrichment that you're looking for. Probably give it 30 to 40 minutes. It will have set. You can then peel it off, pour casting plaster in, and away you go. Another product available from Amazon is alginate. It's the product that they used to use, dentists used to use, taking impressions. I think it was seaweed based. You mix the powder with water. You want to do that on a bench. Pour some of that over it, let it set. That gives good results quite successfully, quite cheaply.
So some of these things are DIY-able, as it were, for those who are prepared to take the time to learn to do it properly.
Yeah, we're working on a project repairing walls and ceilings. A big Victorian house had gone into apartments or flats, and now the current owners wanted it back as one house. They'd taken out partition walls, and where the partition walls had gone, the cornice was still there, but some of the egg and darts were broken and missing. And she said, I don't suppose you can replace those. I thought, if you'd have said that yesterday, I could have brought some materials with me, but I haven't got anything. So we came up with plasticine. Have the children got any plasticine? So she went and found it. We put it in a bag. We sat it on the radiator to warm it up a bit, make it as pliable as possible. And on the egg and darts beside it, we pushed the plasticine on, left it for an hour. So as it cooled down and hardened, we managed to peel it off, pour a bit of casting plaster into the back of it, clean them up because there was overspill, because it wasn't, and then stick them on. The plasticine. It was. I'd like to say it was my idea, but it wasn't. It was Dominic. But yeah, it was as simple as that. We just pressed in some plasticine, pulled it off, and it looked good at the end of it. It looked absolutely in keeping. Yeah, there are quite a few different small techniques that when it comes to repairing some ornamental plasterwork, it can be very successfully tackled by someone who's keen to have a go.
Supposing a homeowner has got, there could be different scenarios, but maybe plain ceilings and they want to put up a cornice for whatever reason, or it had a cornice and it's gone and they want to reinstate it. Fibrous plasters, I mean, they could look round and they can look online and find something probably fairly cheap and cheerful that looks as if it's going to do the job. What are your views on some of these modern cheap and cheerful fibrous cornices and ceiling roses and things? What are the problems that they might encounter if they were to use them?
There are some great companies that specialise in fibrous plasterwork, and they have a huge menu of cornices, ceiling centres, archivolts, fireplaces, overmantels, overdoors. Locker and Riley are a great company. Stevenson's of Norwich, I think they're the only company that have worked for the National Trust, and where they've repaired or replaced cornices for the National Trust, they're now allowed to actually sell that style or that mould of cornice, that profile of cornice. So if you look on Stevenson's of Norwich, you'll see that it might have come from the drawing room from so-and-so, or the ballroom, but you must remember, when it comes to putting a cornice up, that classical orders of architecture come in. So the height of the ceiling, the size of the room. I think most of the fibrous plaster companies will have a guide. If your ceiling height is 9 foot, you need to be looking at this size or profile of cornice. We did have a customer who phoned up and said, I've bought some cornice, I'd like you to come and fit it. I went and had a look at it and I said, I'm sorry, we can't fit it. I was told you could do anything. I said, we can. Sometimes we choose not to. In a bungalow, very fine bungalow, which had a ceiling height of about 2.5, they bought cornices that should have been nearly 4 meters up in the air. I said, you do realise that when you open the door, it's going to look like it's going to bang your head on it. So we didn't do that for them. So when ordering cornice, most of the companies will have a guide to the height of the ceiling. These are the range, or these are the size of cornices that would suit. The companies I mentioned, that there are many others as well. Good quality fibrous cornice, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. We've fitted quite a lot just recently, actually, from Stevenson's and Norwich. But there are many other companies. Gary Jones is in Slough. He's got quite a menu of cornices and ceiling centres. A smaller company, but wonderful, materials that come out of there, products that come out of there, absolutely superb. There are some great ones. The only one I would avoid comes from China. The products come from China. Very lightweight. They are plaster, but they don't have the traditional hessian and laths to fix to. They're mainly plaster and fibres. They are just unpleasant to fit. Trying to achieve a quality job, it's very difficult. Very, very difficult. They're very thin. So when it comes to fixing up a cornice, a traditional fibrous cornice would have, like I say, it'd have a lath wrapped in hessian along the bottom and on the top. So it's mechanically fixed with screws. Yep. Countersink hole. We'll also have adhesive on the back as well. Whereas the Chinese stuff, there's no hessian or laths in there. Some of it is quite hollow. So if you countersink an area to put a screw in along with the adhesive, the screw's got nothing to bite against.
Just plaster. Yeah.
It's just plaster and it can pop through. Also, when you cut the miters, internal or external corners, the miters, the fibres come to the face. So when it comes to joining them together, whereas on the traditional English work that we have, you've got a depth of plaster before you get to the hessian and the laths. So you can cut through that. The hessian's not going to burn or poke through like the fibres do on the Chinese material. So I would avoid it, and we don't fit it. You can try fitting it yourself and you might be very pleased with your result, is the honest truth. But it's not something that we would undertake. Yeah. Lots of other good companies in the UK that provide great quality fibrous plaster. And it's very cost effective when it comes to fibrous plaster as opposed to having it run in situ. It arrives, it's dry. You can clean up your ceiling lines, mark out where it's going to go, key up the ceiling line, key up the wall line, fix little blocks on the wall so you can rest it on with its adhesive, put some screws in it, take it down, strike off top and bottom, and then work your miters. It transforms an ordinary bedroom or hallway or lounge by having even a simple cove dare I say, the old school plasterboard cove is quite nice. But obviously when you've got something with nicer members, nicer details, it transforms a room for sure. And remembering that ornamental plasterwork was the plasma screen or Ferrari of its day. If you could afford ornamental plasterwork, you were showing your wealth. Is what you were doing, like having a carved staircase finial as opposed to just a square one. It was showing your wealth, and ornamental plasterwork was one way of doing that.
We've just been talking about people doing it themselves and fibrous plasterwork, but just thinking about your work that you've done, is there a job you can think of? Firstly, the one that you found the most challenging and head scratching as how on earth were you going to tackle this particular job? Also, the most rewarding, the one that, if you like, the most impressive. Talk us through some of the things you've dealt with that might fall into those categories, sort of thing.
The most challenging jobs, everything we do, we competitively tender. No one's ever come to us and said, can you repair that? Or we have one of these and send me the bill at the end? Everything we do is competitively tendered. And it's only with experience that you gain, normally the hard way. There was a ceiling. I was on my way home on a Friday, rushing, ceiling collapse. It was an insurance project and the cornice to run. Square room with a fireplace. So we've now got 6 internal miters, 2 external miters, and a bay window. So another 2 external miters, and then 3 internal miters on an angle. I didn't pay attention. It was running in situ. Happy with that. And I looked at it and thought, 3 hours. I should be able to do a mitre, start to finish after we've run. Should take me 3 hours. First one, in fairness, took me 7 hours. The first one for my second apprentice, Alex, took him 12 and a half hours. He stood there for 8 hours one day in a corner, mitering, and another 4.5 hours the following day. That sharpens your eye when it comes to pricing up the next job. The reason being, not paying enough attention, it had a double swan neck cove in it. And with podgy little fingers, you've got to bring out the first one, and the plaster comes out of a cove and into a run bead, and then it drops back into another cove. So it was time consuming and fiddly. Alex was 10 out of 10. I'd have given up by then, just thinking that life's too short. The good news is about plasterwork like that, if you're not happy with it, you can chop it out and do it again. It's not like you're carving stone where tap too hard and something's going to fall off and break. Because it's plasterwork on a corner, if you're not happy, chop it out and then have a go again. Most ceilings, from our point of view, they're either lath with lime mortar, lath with earth mortar. The one we're working on at Hatherley at the moment, 60 mil of backing coat, 60 millimetres of backing coat, earth with hair. It's ridiculous, with hair in it, and a fine finishing coat with a beautiful rib geometric pattern run on it. We wouldn't dream of trying to put anything up that thick in lime, let alone in earth mortar. It had been there for 300 years until the end gable fell out and the wind, actually. Unfortunately, like I say, when we got there, they'd taken the whole ceiling down. So it's been counterbattened and plasterboarded. We're plasterboarding it. It's a shapely ceiling. We've evened it out, so it's still got quite a nice roll to it, which we're then going to apply a floating coat of universal one coat onto the plasterboard of a thickness, rule it in, float it, devil float it. We're going to run all the cornices in situ around the outside, and the ribs and the big central ring, we're going to run those in situ as well. We could run it up on a bench and make it in fibrous, but it just won't suit the room. When we're running in situ, it will literally follow undulations of the ceilings and the wall, and it's going to look like it's always been there.
Yeah.
As opposed to when you get fibrous, lengths come in 2.4 or 3 metre lengths, you're going to struggle to. They certainly wouldn't fit the shapes of the ceilings and the walls we've got unless you made them
pack out one bit and make another bit. Yeah, just a bit.
Yeah. So that's what we're going to do to make it. You know, the homeowners, that's what they've asked for. You know, they want it to look as though it's always been there. So we're not going to try and. Yeah. So that's our approach on that. But the challenging ones, the whole team, Dom and Dan, we really enjoy a new challenge, repairing something or replacing something that was there, as we've done. Some of the loveliest work we do, no one ever gets to see. It's in a private home. Some of the work we get to do is in a stately home, or it's in a National Trust property, or something that's open to the public, like a council building, a guild hall, which is open. But some of the loveliest work we get to do, no one other than the family or friends of the family ever get to see the beautiful historic ornamental plasterwork they've got. I have been lucky. I've worked up and down the country, as far as America. I have worked for Royal Household on 3 or 4 occasions, which is breathtaking, really. Some of it was just very simple cornice repairs. It wasn't grand at all, but it's still nice to be a part of it. And yet some of the smallest repairs that we've done, a project, that was for the National Trust actually, the one with the reed ceilings. It had an ellipse as a rib mould, completely out of context, should never have been in the little farm worker's cottage. And we can only consider that it might have been that the son that was living there was working with a plasterer and said to his mum, you know,
Can I have a go?
Can I have a go at one of these? Because it just shouldn't have been in that cottage. There was 3 or 4 other cottages that only ever had flat ceilings. And this one, of its period, had a lovely ellipse. We're very lucky we do get to see some beautiful properties.
You talk about running moulds and everything. Some people might think, well, you're building up actually solid plaster right into the corner. And for the smaller ones, presumably that's the case. But when you've got some of these bigger ones, I am assuming that you create a bit of a timber formwork behind. So the plaster you're putting on is only a surface. I mean, you wouldn't want plaster sort of 9 inches, a foot thick in some places. You'd have a timber armature or formwork behind that, would you?
Absolutely. It's called Scotch bracketing. So you would, if it projects into the ceiling a long way and down the wall, if it's a large cornice, we would only want to put probably 30 to 40 mil of plaster in depth at a time. Anything more than that, we would then start cutting the corner with brackets, Scotch brackets. If it's a simple Georgian run, so it's 45 degrees, it might come down with a drip member and back in, but it's a shallow profile, as it were. Then we would cut triangles, fix them to the wall every 16 inches or 400, run the lathes across them, run muffle coats and backing coats with the muffle plate on the mould, take that off, and then run fine finishing coats on the top. But certainly bigger cornices, it would always be, as you say, timbered out or carcassed out. And some of the coffered ceilings we've worked on, they're exactly the same. Whilst it looks a huge depth of plaster going from the flat of the ceiling to the underside of the coffer and a cos, it's all carpentry. We tend to do a lot of that sort of stuff ourselves, carpentry side of it. Purely, we have an understanding and we know what is and isn't acceptable. If there's a tolerance, we would know that actually the plaster is going to cover that. Whereas some might think the tolerance is acceptable and you go to fit your running moulds or you go to start dividing the coffers or the ribs or whatever it is. And if someone's got it wrong, the formwork's got to come down and start again. You mentioned pendants on a ceiling. They would have been timber carcassed and then the rest of it would be hand modelled or run in situ, little ribs or rings around them. That wouldn't be solid plaster hanging sort of 4 foot from the ceiling with a big ball finial on the bottom and then working its way up. All of that would have been done with a timber carcass, laths, and then the plaster on top.
Do you ever come across some of these Georgian buildings, for example, had timber panelling, then you've got a cornice. Do you ever find that cornice is more timber in it and the plaster is less of it? In other words, you might get sections that are timber and sections that are plaster. Once it's all painted, you'd never know. Do you get that at all, or is that just a no-no?
No. We've seen 2 walls in timber and 2 walls in plaster. Whether the other two walls had come down or failed, and they've gone back in timber. But generally, a period of 1780s, we see a lot of timber cornices. I went to have a look at a project just recently, a wonderful, wonderful building. And I was asked to have a look at the cornices because they were fractured and leaving the ceiling and they were timber. To the inexperienced eye, you might have thought, my goodness me, the plaster cornice is letting go. But they were quite clearly timber, about 8 foot. There was a 45-degree joint, on a straight run. As opposed to a straight joint, they'd sort of scarfed them in on the angle. But yeah, sometimes we've also come across repairs, cornices in modern times that someone's made up a piece of cornice that was missing in various shapes of timber. Alcathene pipe was where there was a roll, which would have been the roll, on the cornice. Someone had found a piece of pipe that was, and they cut it in.
Do. Looks about the right size.
Painted it white. It was, it was a simple. The good news is it's reversible. The bulk of the plasterwork is still there, so it can be revisited at another time.
I think it's worth moving on and just finishing with an overview of aggregates and hair. You've mentioned mixes quite a bit, so just touch on that.
Aggregates wise, 9 times out of 10, we're going to match as close to what was there before. We would use Mike Y, Cornish Lime, Rosa Jericho, coarse backing coats for the pricking up coat with animal hair, coarse animal hair, cow body hair. If you look at cow body hair under a microscope, it's like a piece of barbed wire. Got the strike of the hair with all of these big barbs coming off, which help the lime bind to it. If you look at dog hair under a microscope or human hair, you don't have the same amount of barbs. So whilst you can use it, you're going to need an awful lot of it. But certainly with the sealing we're working on, if you take a piece of the earth mortar or lime mortar, roll it in your hand, early English plasterwork, you'll have a bigger volume of hair than you will have aggregate left in your hand. They're so well haired, and I think that's what's helped them stand the test of time. So aggregate, like I say, we'd use any of the lime suppliers for backing coats and floating coats and fine finishing coats. And a fine finishing coat would be a mature putty with 1 millimetre down of aggregate, so as it can achieve a smooth, sharp finish.
So when you say aggregate in that sense, you're talking about sand, are you?
Sand, yeah. Whilst a lot of people will continue, quite rightly, for external pointing or lime rendering outside, you do need a good quality, well-graded, sharp sand. You want less than 4% of fines, which will be the silt. And the easiest way to do that is with a tumbler test. A third of aggregate or a third of the sand you're wanting to use, 2/3 of water in a jam jar, give it a good shake, set it into the upright and see how long it takes to clear. And also you'll have the bigger aggregate at the bottom with the finer at the top. But if you've got more than 4% of really fine, if you give the jar a little bit of a shake and it starts swirling, that we would class as a dirty sand. So for external rendering, whether it's ornamental, stucco or just flat work, it needs to be a good clean sand. Whereas on lath and plaster ceilings, you can use earth, as I said before, so which are clearly full of clays and impurities.
Talking about the hair, some years ago I dealt with an expert witness case where there'd been a failure. And when I looked at the mix, you just couldn't see any hair in it. And I said, there's just no hair in this. And they said, yes, there was. And I said, well, there's not now. And what we figured out, they'd used a premix. It was, it was almost a premix. Our working theory was that because it hadn't carbonated, carbonation had been, halted or slowed, but the hair had been put in, the hair had degraded. Therefore, what they should have done was add more hair in as they used it on site. And one of the things I used to specify quite a lot is if you think you've got enough hair in it, put more in, because more is better. And make sure you've got enough in. Don't, skimp on the hair at all. Is that a fair enough approach, or?
It is. We learned a long time ago, we don't buy our lime mortar. As commercial plasterers, traditional plasterers, small projects, we will mix our own match if that's what's needed. But the project we're on at the moment, I think we've had 32 tonnes, and that came from Cornish lime. Delivered 9 tonnes at a time on a high ab. Now have forced action mixers. We add the hair and or fibres at the time. I did a ceiling, one of the earliest ceilings I did was for the National Trust here in Coomartin at West Chalacombe Manor. And it was in a porch, open porch, with a passage above it going into the bedrooms. They phoned up, I gave them a price, it was accepted, we're good to go. I fixed the laths, I put the pricking up coat on, I left it 2 to 3 weeks. Haired mortar had been bought in. Someone else was going to tackle it, chose not to, whatever. We priced it, it was accepted, right, we'll do it. We've got the lime mortar down there. It's got hair in it. All right, we'll use. How long's it been there? Not long. That was the end of the conversation. We lathed it. We put the pricking up coat on the first coat, cross-hatched it, left it 2-3 weeks. Good airflow, carbonated nicely. We put the floating coat on. We left that about a week and a half during the summer months. We put the fine finishing coat on, and it looked beautiful. It was only 2.5 metres by 2.5 metres. Not a big area. I got a phone call about 10 days later. Can we meet at the job? We've had a failure. And when we got there, the ceiling was on the floor. And the surveyor said, thing is, when we took this property on, the ceiling looked exactly like that, like a bold man. Nothing in the middle, but hair, plaster around the edges. And I said, well, I don't know what to say. All 3 coats were beautifully laminated together. We'd added more hair at the time. That wasn't a problem. And I stood there receiving quite a talking to from the surveyor. And I said to Alex, go upstairs and see if anyone's dropped a wardrobe, if there's any dents in the floorboards. And with that, We heard him go up the stairs, come across the hallway, and he walked across the ceiling, and both the surveyor and I got covered in dust. In fairness, he looked at me and said, "There's too much flex in those joists, isn't there?" I said, "There are." I said, "They should have had herringbone noggins or, put in." Yeah, they should have done. I said, "That wasn't down to us." And my inexperience at the time didn't look at the ceiling and think that should have some noggins or herringbones. I mean, it was a relatively short span, 2.4 by 2.4, 8 foot by 8 foot. Reasonable sized joist, but obviously just tired. And when we took the lathes off, we were paid to do it again. When we took the lathes off, there was evidence where the herringbone noggins were, but had failed. Someone had taken them out for whatever they were doing and they didn't get put back in. Had there been a lot more hair in it, it might have held it up a bit better. But the hair that's, when we first started using lime mortar 30-something years ago, the hair that come from China, English hair, they've not allowed to use English hair because of the threat of anthrax, apparently, although I don't know anyone that's had it tested. We have hair samples or mortar samples tested for anthrax, and I don't know of anyone that's come back with a positive. So all the hair comes from China. Years ago, we would happily mix up the mortar and leave it for a month, 5 weeks, possibly 6 weeks, with the hair in it. You would open the bag, you'd smell the hair, but you'd pull it out and there was still good tensile strength. Whereas now, quite how they're heat treating or chemically treating the hair, all of these products from all of the lime suppliers from China, and it's weakened it dramatically. We will only mix it on the day, and if we have got any left over with hair in it, then we'll just make sure and add the correct amount of hair. We try and get 2.5 kilos of hair per cubic metre of mortar. Some suppliers supply it with about 1 kilo, but for pricking up coats onto lathes and backing coats, the way forward is 2 kilos minimum, really. And it is a very, very hairy mix. It's difficult to spread. So yes, the hair that's being used today, we would only recommend you add the hair in for the mix for the day. Whilst it's extremely alkali while it's wet, once it's dried or cured or carbonated, it's inert, so it doesn't attack the hair anymore. Hence the reason historic mortar samples or plaster samples we've got are still full of hair. Plus the fact it would have come from the closest abattoir is where the hair would have come from, and all it would have been done after it. So the only reason they were soaking it with oak chips or whatever for the tanning purposes of the tanners is to soak it, is to soften the follicles so as the hair would come out. And one of the reasons it's very difficult to get English hair from tanners' yards now is most of the tanners use chemicals to dissolve the hair. So it's just not there.
There isn't any hair.
No, that's exactly it. Yeah, I have the same feeling. So yeah, it's hair is a massive part of the material, and it's too easy to overlook the fact whilst you can buy it with hair in it, it's not something that we would do anymore. We would only add the hair on the day.
What about man-made hair and
Man-made
fibres?
Like these?
Yeah.
I think they're polypropylene flock fibres, 18 millimetres in length. They work incredibly well. They do work very, very well. Depending on the project, we would probably still go with animal hair. Friends have got horses, and every time they're clipped, they pick up the clippings, and I use those in backing coats and things for certain projects. Other ones, we will use the modern fibres. But the modern flock fibres, they're very, very good. A lot of this modern fibres came through the concrete industry. Some of the fibres you can get are just way too strong. They stand out on the wall. So once you've plastered them in, you start your floating, they'll just stand out. Don't burn them off with the plumber's blowtorch. Sets off the fire alarms. Which is incredibly embarrassing. When you're working on a certain project and they have to phone the fire brigade and say, no, it's a false alarm, we know what it is, you don't need to attend. Yes, so don't do that. But yeah, a lot of the modern fibres come from the concrete industry, but the flock fibres, you can buy them on Amazon. You can buy them through lime suppliers. They work really, really well. They certainly give good tensile support to lime mortars.
And thinking of additives generally, insulating additives are all the rage at the moment. Now, presumably, you don't. Do you ever get asked about that for ceiling plaster? Any insulating additive, if it's on an upper floor below a roof, or is that something you've not had to deal with?
No, it's not. We've not come across anyone wanting any insulating plasters on ceilings. I don't feel as though ceilings need to breathe in the same respect as they do on masonry or solid wall construction. They need to be sort of semi-flexible rather than a hard brittle mortar will crack terribly. A softer mortar, more flexible on a ceiling, I find generally has better longevity to it. But no, we wouldn't be looking to insulate ceilings. Although we did have a discussion at summer school about pugging.
Oh, yes, we did, yeah.
Which was in an 1832 building, lath and plaster ceilings we were replacing after a collapse. And in between the joists, so from the underside, you've got the underside of the joist with the upstands, then there was a batten fixed. There was lath of a nature, but not riven lath. And then on top of that was lime mortar, haired lime mortar thrown onto the top of that before the floorboards go down. And I can't remember if you decided whether that was a form of insulation or soundproofing.
I think it's my experience. It's more to do with soundproofing, but I've seen it above cellars. There was a job I dealt with not long before I retired, or just about the time I retired, and it was an old late Georgian mansion that was in pretty dire condition. And I'm pretty certain I've got the photographs of it, and I'll put one up of the pugging that I found. But that was over a cellar, so I wouldn't have imagined that would have been for sound. I think that was much more likely for insulation to stop the main room above getting. Yeah, exactly. The cellar underneath would be cold. You didn't want that coming up. And I've come across it mainly in Georgian and Victorian buildings. And I've got some books here from the late Victorian period that talk about it. And I think some of them have even got diagrams of it being used as well. I can put some B-roll on this showing some of that. But I think it's a combination of different things. Yeah.
I mean, you must remember with the thickness of the lath and plaster, by comparison of a sheet of plasterboard, do explain to people that when they're going to rip it all out, whatever they want to do for whatever reason, the sound deadening qualities of plasterboard have no comparison to lath and plaster. Yeah. And you will notice the difference straight away.
Well, the plasterboard is like a drum skin, isn't it, compared to lath and plaster?
Yeah, it's quite taut.
I mean, the only other strange situation I've come across, well, not strange, it's not strange in the East anyway, with lath and plaster ceilings is under pantile roofs, where the lath and plaster has been put up as a form of lining. And this is in an unoccupied attic space. It was never intended to be occupied. The lath and plaster is purely there to act as a lining under the pantile.
Right.
I don't suppose you've come across that in the Southwest, have you?
We haven't come across that. What we have done late last year, in between the bat seasons, September the 2nd till end of October, we carried out the torching. We plastered the underside of rag slate directly to the underside of the slate. Some of the historic ones, the rag slates were actually fixed on laths. So the pegs were hanging onto the laths of the slates, and then we did the plastering torching directly to the underside of the slates. And for that, we used a very, very well haired hot mix mortar, incredibly sticky, and that's to help stop the wind and the vibration of the slates, because they're sat on pegs, which is traditional. That was just outside of Bodmin, but no, not so much lath and plaster to the underside of pan tiles. Not seen that.
I haven't seen it often, but I have come across it a couple of times in my career. But yeah.
And that about wraps up this episode. And in fact, it's the last in the current series that we've been doing online. We've covered everything from mortars and pointing to substrates, exposure, and now decorative plasterwork. And we really hope it's helped you feel more confident when it comes to looking after an older building. We've got a whole new theme coming up next, so if you found these episodes helpful, don't forget to subscribe and hit that little notification bell so you don't miss what's coming up. As always, if you want to speak to someone one-on-one about your project, head over to expertable.com. And if you're interested in learning more from Stephen, and if you're a professional, you'll find all these details in the description below. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.
You've been listening to Talking Conservation,
the podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
With me, Stephen Boniface.
And me, Rich Aylesbury.